Oh, okay. Hello, my name's Aiden. I'm a clinical exercise physiologist. I'm also a grad student in nutrition and dietetics. And I just wanted to pop in and make a YouTube video today on a tool I've been working on these past couple weeks that I thought might be useful for some runners or some endurance athletes, or maybe even some resistance training athletes, or just anyone really that's trying to improve their performance. And so if you've ever been to a run store or an outdoor store, you might have seen these little packets of gels that they sell. These are energy gels or intra-carb gels. And if you've ever noticed the price tag on them, you could probably tell that they would quickly add up if you were doing a serious training block or having a couple of them a week. And as a grad student who's doing their first marathon prep and trying to save money where I can, I quickly thought to myself, like, is there a way for me to just make these myself that is like much cheaper to hopefully save money on sometimes the biggest expense when it comes to a marathon prep. So that's kind of the point of this video, is to share my recipe with all of you, but also hopefully go over the science of what intra-carb gels are, why they matter, how I formulated this, to hopefully empower you with some of the science to make your own decisions around how you fuel your workouts. So we're gonna go over some of the science. If you wanna skip to the actual recipe itself, I'll leave the timestamp up and you can just go straight there. But we're gonna dive into it. Just to start with a disclaimer, this is meant as like general education. I'm a clinical exercise physiologist. I'm not a dietitian. This doesn't replace any personalized medical or nutrition advice that you'd receive from a qualified professional. And if you are interested in designing a race plan that suits you, working with an exercise physiologist like myself and a sports dietitian is the way to go to make sure your training and nutrition is both safe and effective. So where does this all begin, I guess is the first question. And that's the fueling problem with endurance sports. So we have two sources of energy when we exercise: fat and carbohydrate. And they're both being used simultaneously, no matter what type of exercise you're doing. But depending on the intensity, the preference changes. So at higher intensities, we use a little bit more carbohydrate, and at lower intensities, we use a little bit more fat. Now, we obviously store our fat for energy in adipocytes, or body fat. And this can be visceral or subcutaneous, or even like brown or beige fat. But for carbohydrates, we store them within our muscle cells and our liver cells. So it's glycogen. Carbohydrate stores are actually much more finite in most cases than our body fat stores. So hopefully you can see how as we lose stored carbohydrate and we shift more to fat oxidation, which is a slower source of energy, we're gonna start feeling fatigue, or performance might drop, and that's not conducive to performance gains in the long term if you're really focusing on endurance. And so that's where intra-carbs, or carbohydrates consumed during your workouts, come into play. And so these maintain blood sugar from what you're consuming rather than from what you store. And so this spares liver and muscle glycogen over time. It's not going to completely counteract you using your liver and muscle glycogen. Eventually you'll probably still run out, but it just helps spare it to delay fatigue. So one unique benefit as well is it might blunt the stress response from training because you're not having to mobilize as many of your stored energy, and you're getting it from your consumed energy, depending on your circumstance, of course. So naturally, I think what I asked next is, why am I using gels instead of just like hucking back some Sour Patch Kids or some Nerds gummy clusters? A couple of reasons might be because the carbs have a higher density than most drinks and most solids, which means you can get more in faster with a lower volume. And this prevents things like sloshing in the gut when you're running. It can be kind of uncomfortable. Or the gels are also faster to digest than most solids, which means they're absorbed a lot quicker, which means you can spare liver and muscle glycogen, hopefully at an improved rate. Compared to liquids, they're also safer to consume. This is just kind of like a practical thing. So hopefully you can continue running, continue breathing while you're consuming them. They're also lower fiber content and lower in other macronutrients or even micronutrients, which helps like focus on getting a large amount of carbohydrate in without any other unnecessary nutrients. Another benefit is you can control what's in them. So you can control the ratio of different sugars to improve absorption, which we'll also go through. And you can sneak in things like electrolytes or caffeine if you're interested in those things. So I guess the main part of this, these intracarb gels that are made are really expensive. In fact, like high-end energy gels can cost around like $5 to $5.50 per gel. This is in Canadian dollars. And they provide around 25 grams of carbs. Now, over a 16-week training block, if you're having like 4 up to 8 gels a week sometimes, this could easily be $700 to $1,400. And that's just in one training block. For those who train year round, this could obviously be much higher. Now, the gel recipe I have been using it ends up costing around $1.18 per gel. So it's around 80% cheaper, 79% cheaper, but it provides 60 grams of carbs. So you're getting more than double the amount of carbohydrate. So over a 16-week training block, this might cost you $75 to $151 if you're having the same amount. So you can get upwards of $1,000 worth of savings in 16 weeks. Okay, so this is kind of the complex-ish part, the sugar concentration ratio. I'll try and explain it the best I can. In these energy gels, in most carbohydrate gels, you have two sources of energy. You have glucose and fructose. But glucose can only be absorbed at a max rate. So you can absorb all the glucose that you consume, but the rate is capped. And so eventually think of it like a highway. So once the traffic gets full, you kind of have to open up another lane to increase the rate of absorption. And that's where fructose comes in. So we can use fructose once we're consuming enough carbohydrate total to increase the rate of absorption so we can get enough in per hour. So roughly around like 60 grams per hour, glucose transport becomes saturated and it kind of starts to slow down. And that's where fructose taking over is really beneficial. And as you get above 60 grams per hour, it becomes more beneficial. So if you're consuming less than 60 grams per hour carbohydrate, you might be able to just rely on glucose and it might not be that big of a deal or whatever. But generally the higher per hour that you're trying to consume, you want a little bit more fructose. So this recipe uses close to an even balance of each. If you're fructose intolerant or anything like that, then you can obviously adjust that. So just to quickly recap, the main benefits of this is you choose the texture, you choose the flavor, you choose the carb density, which helps with like GI tolerance and things. You choose the ratio of glucose and fructose, which can help depending on how many grams per hour you're aiming for. And again, it's cheaper over the long term, but it does cost more upfront. Now, the main disadvantages are that they're not shelf stable, so you have to make them once or twice a week. The upfront cost may not be worth it unless you're like a year-round runner, you have a big training block. They're not as convenient, so you have to store them yourself and refrigerate them and bring them with you on your runs, and then keep the containers. And it's got character sometimes. So, if you're not careful and you don't like mix it well enough, you might get like a chunk or two. So the recipe makes 3 gels, each 100 milliliters. So if my grade 6 math is correct, 300 milliliters total volume, 100 milliliters each gel. So the total carbohydrates for this recipe is 180, and I did that so that there's 60 grams of carbohydrates per gel. All right, so now we're gonna get into the recipe itself, and I'll show you how I make it, and we'll come back. So we got our ingredients assembled. We got dextrose and fructose, our main sources of energy and carbohydrate. Then we got your salt, which can be used for electrolyte replenishment and also help you digest the carbs. Then sodium alginate, which is our main gelling agent, and calcium lactate gluconate, which is that solidifier that helps bind the gel. I used an orange emulsification. You can obviously switch that up and get whatever flavor you like. And you're gonna need 2 to 3 holding containers. You can get these at any outdoor store. So jumping into the recipe, you're gonna start with 200 milliliters of water in a blender and then adding in our sodium alginate. The recipe calls for 2.5 teaspoons. You might need 2, you might need 3. I would start with 2, blend it and see what the texture is looking like. So looking at the viscosity, it was a little thinner than I like. So I added in another half teaspoon and then just blended it again. And you can see now it's much thicker. So this will thicken as you let it hydrate too. Then in a separate bowl, I weighed out the glucose and the fructose. So 100 grams of glucose and 80 grams of fructose to get that 1 to 0.8 ratio. And then I added our water gel mixture to a pan on low heat. You just want to heat this up to around 40 to 50 degrees, nothing crazy, just enough to help the carbs dissolve without ruining the chemical bonds of the gelling agent. Then in a separate measuring cup, I put a pinch of calcium lactate gluconate and pre-mixed it so it doesn't clump. And you really don't need that much, just a little pinch. I slowly added that to the mixture while mixing so that no solid clumps formed. And you can see it's still pretty liquidy. That's because it's hot, and as it cools, it'll get more solid. So I added in the flavoring, just a small splash, and mix that in. This is also the time to add your salt. You can see it's already starting to gel. So I got out my funnel and my holding containers and I just poured it in there. Again, making sure these are food safe and not too hot, and then threw those into the fridge to store. So I hope that was interesting, and just some closing remarks if you plan to try this recipe out yourself is just the recipe as needed for like your GI comfort, your carb density, your training schedule, your budget and all these things. Always test your fueling strategy before you race. And last, but definitely not least, have fun. This was super fun for me to research and learn about and make my own. It was like a food science project almost. And so I hope it feels the same for you. And yeah, just enjoy your training. If you're interested in getting yourself set up with a race plan, or you want to check out my clinical exercise physiology services, or even my virtual fitness coaching, check out amexercisephysiology.ca. I also have blogs there with plenty of subjects to read on. Some of my recent ones were core training. I share some recipes on there as well. And have a great week.